Histology, starting a new topic. I want to introduce you guys to histology. You've probably heard the name before with the levels of organization in biology. You go from cells to tissues. The term histology is basically the study of tissues. But before we get into the study of tissues, let's talk about what a tissue is. Just a big picture understanding of what a tissue is. A tissue, a lot of times they teach in biology that a tissue is a bunch of cells working together. And that's a good starting definition, but it's actually more than that. So it's not just the cells. We're looking at some tissues right here, but it's also the stuff between the cells. So this is a tissue you probably aren't familiar with, and we're going to learn it in detail a little later. But I want to show you that there's more than just cells in here. This is a cell. This is a cell. All of these things are little cells. And so, of course, that's an important part of the tissue. But there's also the stuff that isn't cells, and that is broadly referred to as extracellular material, meaning outside the cells. And it is often referred to as matrix as well, and we'll break the matrix down a little bit later. But the matrix usually has potentially a combination of protein fibers. This is a protein fiber. And then all of the stuff that is not cells and not matrix is generally called a ground substance. And it can be almost completely liquid to pretty darn solid, depending on what kind of tissue you're talking about. So, broaden our definition of histology and tissues to say it's not just the cells functioning together, it's the cells and the stuff between the cells, the extracellular material functioning together. So the definition of histology, as I mentioned, is the study of tissues. There are going to be 4 categories of tissues, and then today we're going to start on one of them, which is called epithelial tissues. But let me just introduce you to the 4 categories of tissues. There's a table in your textbook that goes through them, but we'll go through them through this set of notes as well. So regardless of whether you're talking about a human or a wolf, maybe wolf, I don't know, dog, there are 4 big categories of tissues, and sometimes the categories are intuitive, like they seem like they'd go together, and sometimes it's not, because sometimes it's based on embryology, like where the tissue came from. But epithelial tissue, that's what we're going to do in this lecture, and it'll probably take 2 to get through that one. Epithelial tissue is the tissue that you find covering outer surfaces. Now, hair isn't a tissue, but on my outer surface there is actually a tissue, epithelial tissue. Outer surfaces and also inner surfaces. So it covers surfaces, outer and inner, and forms glands. My anatomy professor always said that you can find an epithelial tissue anywhere that you can stick your finger, right? Up here, down here. Even if you could imagine that your finger could be infinitely small and you could stick it inside a pore or something. It's also lining internal surfaces, like lining blood vessels and lining the insides of your intestines and your urogenital tract. And we'll talk about it in a lot of detail. Connective tissue is the tissue that is going to support and bind things together. If I have 2 layers of tissue, if I have, for instance, skin and I have muscle, there's going to be a packing tissue, connective tissue between them. So it's usually between any 2 other tissues. It's also resisting gravity, like bone is a connective tissue and cartilage is a connective tissue. Ligaments and tendons strapping things to one another are connective tissues. Connective tissues is really the broadest category of the 4 basic types of tissues. It's really variable in structure, it's really variable in function, and we'll spend some time on that one. Muscle tissue, there's 3 kinds. Skeletal muscle, which is attached to your bones and moves them around primarily. Cardiac muscle, which is found in the wall of your heart. It's responsible for the pumping of the heart. And smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is the involuntary muscle that you would find in the wall of your digestive tract, your urogenital tract, in the walls of your blood vessels. And then nervous tissue or neural tissue is for control and communication. So, of course, your brain is almost all nervous tissue, and your spinal cord, but then there's nervous tissue going to and from other tissues. Generally speaking, and we'll talk about this at the end of this set of notes, if you want to go up to the next level of organization and make an organ, you're usually going to use at least one of each of these categories of tissues. So let me just like conceptualize that with you. If you were looking at my heart or at this dog's heart, you would have lining the inside of the heart because it was lining something. That would, for instance, be an epithelial tissue. And then going from the inside of the heart, the next tissue you'd run into would be a connective tissue between that and the cardiac muscle tissue, right? And then you'd run into some more tissues on the way out. But in order to control and communicate with the heart, you would wire it up with nervous tissue. So most organs that you're going to run into, not all, but most organs usually have at least one of the 4 types of tissues, and we'll reinforce that at the end of this set of notes. Okay, so now let me introduce you to an epithelial tissue, epithelial tissue in general. Epithelia is plural, epithelium is singular, and sometimes you can also call them epithelial tissues. But the word epithelial is an adjective and it needs the word tissues after it. So where do I find epithelium? Again, we already talked about this. So we're going to find epithelial tissue, and that's what you're seeing in this figure right here. Covering body surfaces, lining body cavities, and also forming glands. So again, anywhere you could stick your finger if your finger could be infinitely small. Outer, inner surfaces, up my nose, on the surface of my eyeball, in my ear, down my throat all the way out the other way, up the urethra, up the urogenital tract. All of those are epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissue is generally going to be your boundaries between the internal and external environment, and also internal structures will use epithelial tissues as their boundaries. So one of the things that tends to be true about epithelial tissues is that the cells are really close together. There's no spaces between them like there, for instance, was here. That's important because you need to basically make a really, really good intact structure. So let's talk about just an organ that you are familiar with a little bit. So the esophagus, of course, goes from the mouth to the stomach, and lining the esophagus would be epithelial tissue. Students often have trouble with histology because it's hard to put together the gross anatomy, the things that you can see, with the microscopic anatomy. So I just want to take a minute to do that with you. So if I took my esophagus or a dog's esophagus, what I want to do is I want to get down to the microscopic level and actually look at it, right? So what I'm going to do is I am actually going to take a section of it, and let's talk about that. And I'm going to look at the tissue that lines the section. So stick with me for just a second. So now what I'm looking at is I am looking at an esophagus. So where is the inside of the esophagus? Where's the outside of the esophagus? What am I actually seeing? What kind of section is this? Because we looked at different types of sections before. So this looks like a longitudinal section, because if it was a cross section, remember it's a tube, right? So if it was a cross section, it would be a circle, right? And I would be looking for the tissue lining it right here, but it's not a cross section. It's a longitudinal section. So right here, this space that I'm seeing in white right here, that is the lumen of the esophagus. This tissue from here to here, right there, that is going to be the epithelial tissue. And I know you're not quite used to figuring out when tissues change type, but I'll sort of teach you that as we go along. And then just to reinforce what we've just talked about, this tissue right here is probably going to be connective tissue, and this one right here is actually going to be muscle. So right now what we're actually interested in is the tissue right here, right? The epithelial tissue. So how could I tell it's an epithelial tissue? Well, that's what we're going to get to in just a second. I can tell it's an epithelial tissue because it's clearly close to a surface. So before I go any further, let me try to tell you why you would care about histology at all. So this is a healthy esophagus, mammalian esophagus. It's like, could be from you or your dog. They're pretty much the same. So how do you know whether a tissue is healthy or not healthy? Well, you know what the normal histology looks like. And then if you were a pathologist, and I'm not, you would also know when it looks abnormal. So let me show you some esophaguses or esophagi, I don't know. So the tissue right here looks similar to the tissue right here, right? And then when you start to get cancerous or precancerous conditions, and esophageal cancer is not that uncommon, then what happens is that the cells, the tissue starts to look a little different, and then it starts to look very different. Now, I'm not asking you to do any diagnostic, of course, because I can't even do it. But the diagnostics for instance, cancer often start with a person who has a very deep understanding of both what normal histology and abnormal histology looks like. And that, of course, would be a pathologist. So just to tell you why it would matter. So, for instance, if you suspect breast cancer, they will do a biopsy, take out some of the cells and look at them under a microscope, and a trained pathologist knows what the normal tissue looks like and when it looks abnormal. So it's one of the reasons why this is actually an important part, an important field. Okay, so let's look at some things that are characteristic of epithelial tissues. So go back to this picture of the dog for just a second. So look at these tissues, and then we'll look at some things that they have in common. We're going to do a blow up of one that kind of looks like that. All right, so tissues right here. So what do these have in common? So first, let's make sure that we can tell where the epithelial tissue is. One of the things that's a little hard for students is that when you're looking at a histology slide, there's usually more than one type of tissue on there, because tissues in the human body are really close to one another. So you kind of have to know what you're looking for. So let's look here and figure out what we're looking for. So in this figure right here, if you could see it, the lumen would be right here, and so the epithelial tissue would be right there. And then this would probably be a connective tissue right there, okay? So you kind of have to know what you're looking at. So let's look at this top tissue in a little bit more detail. Generally speaking, epithelial tissues are avascular, meaning that if I get a section of an epithelial tissue like I have here, I'm not going to get a nerve or a cross section of a nerve or a long section of a nerve in an epithelial. Oh, sorry, that's not what I meant. I'm not going to get a blood vessel within the epithelial tissue. This one right here is below the epithelial tissue. So generally speaking, epithelial tissues are avascular. They do not have blood vessels running through them. So, but it's counterintuitive that they're avascular because they are also capable of really, really rapid cell division and regeneration. And that seems like an oxymoron, to not have a direct blood supply but be capable of rapid cell division and regeneration. So how do they accomplish both? Because hopefully it seems logical to you that cell division and regeneration is pretty expensive, energetically expensive. So you'd think you would need a lot of blood and oxygen in order to do that. Well, what happens is these tissues, even the thickest one, the thickest epithelial tissue is microscopically thin. So what happens is they can get their blood flow from the tissue under them. The metaphor that I like to use is like, okay, so if you make a grape jelly sandwich and you accidentally sit it in a puddle on your counter, if you give it a minute, will the puddle be purple? Yeah, it will, because it doesn't have very far to go. And will the top slice of bread eventually be purple? Yeah, it will. But so that works really well because it's thin. But if I put 7 grape jelly sandwiches on top of one another, would the top slice still be purple? No, it had too far to go. So as long as these are microscopically thin, then diffusion is effective for getting nutrients up and waste down, oxygen up and carbon dioxide down. So they are capable of rapid cell division and regeneration, even though the tissue is generally avascular. Now, let's go back to the rapid cell division and regeneration thing for just a second. These tissues are at surfaces. Surfaces tend to get a lot of wear and tear inside of your mouth. You can, for instance, bite the side of your cheek or bite your tongue. That's all epithelial tissue on the surface. And the rapid cell division and regeneration means that a couple hours later, you might not even know that it happened. You can scrape the surface of your skin if it's not too deep. It doesn't go into the connective tissue within a matter of 24, 48, 72 hours. You might not even see that it occurred there. So it's good for protection, especially the thicker that it gets. But it needs to repair itself relatively readily. So, the fact that it has a predisposition to rapid cell division and regeneration is both good for repair and regeneration, and also potentially problematic, because tissues that rapidly divide also have a higher statistical likelihood of getting cancer, because cancer is simply losing control of your cell division cycle. And that is very likely to happen in tissues that already divide very frequently. So if you think about a lot of the cancers that they occur in epithelial tissues on surfaces, like skin cancer, like lung cancer, or the epithelial tissue that makes up glands, like breast cancer, like thyroid cancer, like pituitary cancer. So it's both good and potentially negative that this tissue divides really quickly. Okay, and then what I mistakenly said before about innervation, the tissue is generally avascular, meaning that the tissue itself right here doesn't have any blood vessels running through it. But even though it's not shown in this figure, quite often epithelial tissues are highly innervated. And innervated may or may not be a term that you know. It's right here. Innervated means really connected to the nervous system. And, your skin is really connected to the nervous system. It has touch, temperature, pressure, pain receptors. It's a really, really good place to have rich innervation at the boundaries between you and the external environment. So that's a good way to think about why and how and what it's for, the innervation that comes with epithelial tissues. And then the cells tend to be right next to one another. Here's a cell, here's its neighbor, here's its neighbor, here's its neighbor, its neighbor. They're lined right up against one another, and generally they are going to be touching one another. So they're very, very closely packed cells, like here, 1, 2. So there's really not much room for matrix or extracellular material like we talked about here. So here it's a cell, and then its friend is all the way over here, and then it's not here until I get the next one. So there's lots of room for extracellular material or matrix in this type of tissue. That's not epithelial tissue. In epithelial tissue, however, there's very little room for matrix. So let's look at that from this esophagus. So all of these cells are really smashed up against one another, very little room for matrix. And then what is true for most epithelia, not glandular epithelia, but most epithelia, is that there is a free surface, because there's a surface that has nothing stuck to it, because that's the boundary between you and the external environment, or between the wall of the digestive tract and the lumen of the digestive tract. So basically there's kind of like a top and a bottom side, although they don't have to be top and bottom. So this side has nothing stuck to it. We call that the apical or apical surface. Apex as in top, but it doesn't have to be on the top because it can be upside down. And then this surface right here is called the basal surface. Basal as in bottom, as in base. Okay, again, it doesn't have to be on the bottom. So what's the difference? This one isn't stuck to anything, and this one is stuck to stuff. So apical surface and basal surface. Let's find it in this figure. This is the apical surface of the tissue, and this is the basal surface of the tissue. Let's look at it in a couple more histology slides. Okay, so I find the free surface, the tissue right next to the free surface. This is the epithelial tissue, this is the apical surface, and this is the basal surface of the epithelial tissue. Okay, now the next thing is the concept of the basement membrane. So let me introduce you to the concept of the basement membrane. So there is epithelial tissue, and like I told you, there's almost always connective tissue underneath it. Well, what sticks them together is like an adhesive. Think of it like a two-part adhesive. I don't know if you've ever seen those two-parts adhesives. It squirts out and then it's not sticky until it sticks together. So what you have right here is the basement membrane that is secreted in part by the epithelial tissue and in part by the connective tissue below it. When it gets together, it's actually pretty sticky. And so think of it like the adhesive you use to tile a floor. That's the basement membrane. The basement membrane isn't a tissue. So this is a tissue composed of cells and other stuff, and this is a tissue composed of cells and other stuff. The basement membrane is the structure, the adhesive that sticks them together. And sometimes it stains super duper well, like here. So apical surface, basal surface, basement membrane is what you're seeing in blue right here. Sometimes it doesn't stain very well, but it still has to be there. It's sticking the two of them together. So that is the concept of a basement membrane. It's extracellular material, it's extracellular sticky stuff, proteins and sugars. Then in addition, sometimes, and you can see it here too. So here's your basement membrane right here, okay? Sometimes to keep the tissue, the epithelial tissue stuck to the connective tissue, in addition to the basement membrane, imagine actually doing a spot weld from the epithelial tissue down, and that structure right there is called a hemidesmosome. Really what it is reaching the cytoskeleton into the proteins of the basement membrane and holding on. Hemi means half. It's half of a desmosome. We're going to learn a desmosome in just a second. So it's basically, in addition to the sticky stuff, you spot weld it every once in a while and it makes it stay stuck. Okay, so now let's just make it a simple labeling thing that we're going to do in this little figure in your notes. So with this in mind, hopefully now what you can do is label the apical surface, the basal surface, and the basement membrane. And also hopefully you can recognize that this is an epithelial tissue. Okay, so how do you recognize it's an epithelial tissue? Again, this is the epithelial tissue. The cells are right next to one another, right? They're right next to one another. And although it's a little hard to see, this would be the lumen. Okay, that would be the lumen. And so it's got a free surface. So this surface right here is the apical surface. This surface down here, not the basement membrane, but the surface of the cells sitting on top of the basement membrane, that right there would be the basal surface. Okay. And then what about this structure right here? That structure, let me make that a little thinner. Okay, this structure right there, what is that? That is the basement membrane. Okay, basement membrane. Apical surface, basal surface, basement membrane, and then I added lumen in there because you can also do lumen on that figure. Okay, so basement membrane we already talked about. Okay, so the next thing that we will do in the next set of notes is to talk about how we in the next video is to talk about how we are going to name and identify epithelial tissue. So we'll do that in the next one.